My sugar baby turned out to be my rich husband's brother. Family dinner got awkward. Hello, Reddit. My name is Lisa, and I'm 33 years old. To anyone looking in from the outside, my life probably seems perfect. I'm married to Daniel, a successful businessman who's worked hard to build an empire. We live in a gorgeous house with sprawling gardens and floor-to-ceiling windows that flood every room with light. We go on extravagant vacations to places most people only dream of, and I have a closet full of designer clothes, bags, and shoes. By all accounts, I'm living the kind of life people envy. But behind the shiny facade, my reality feels hollow. Daniel is a good man, a provider in every sense of the word, but he's always been more focused on his work than anything else. He runs a multinational company, which means endless meetings, business trips, and late-night phone calls. When he's not physically gone, he's emotionally absent, glued to his laptop or phone. I've spent years trying to convince myself that this is just what comes with marrying a man like him, that the luxury and comfort make up for the loneliness. But the truth is, I felt invisible for a long time. In the early years of our marriage, things were different. Daniel was attentive, charming, and funny. He made time for me despite his busy schedule, and I felt like I was the center of his world. But as his business grew, so did the distance between us. I tried to talk to him about it, to tell him how lonely I felt, but he would always reassure me with the same lines. I'm doing this for us, or just a few more years, and I'll slow down. I believed him at first, but years went by and nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. He started taking longer trips, spending more nights in the office, and I began to feel like I was just a fixture in his life, something he could come home to when it was convenient for him. At first, I tried to fill the void in healthy ways. I took up yoga, threw myself into decorating the house, and even started volunteering. But none of it worked. No matter how busy I kept myself, the loneliness was always there, lurking in the background. I'd sit in our enormous empty house, scrolling through photos of couples on social media who looked so happy, so in love, and wonder what had happened to us. I missed feeling wanted, feeling seen. A year ago, in a moment of weakness, I did something I never thought I'd do. I signed up for a sugar dating site. I told myself it was just for fun, that it wasn't a big deal. I rationalized it by saying I wasn't actually looking for anything serious. I just wanted to feel desired again, to hear compliments and have someone pay attention to me. It felt harmless at the time, like a little secret I could keep to myself. I convinced myself it was separate from my marriage, that it didn't mean I was unhappy with Daniel. I just needed something he couldn't give me. The site was overwhelming at first. Hundreds of messages flooded my inbox, men promising me the world in exchange for my time. Most of them came across as desperate or sleazy, and I almost deleted my account after the first day. But then I got a message from Nick. His profile was different. He wasn't trying too hard or throwing money around to impress me. He was charming and confident, and his messages felt genuine. He told me he was looking for companionship, someone to share fun moments with, no strings attached. It was exactly what I wanted to hear. I told myself I was just curious when I replied to him, but deep down, I think I knew it wouldn't stop there. We started chatting regularly, and I found myself looking forward to his messages. He made me laugh, complimented me in ways I hadn't heard in years, and made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. It felt intoxicating, like a lifeline in the middle of the loneliness I had been drowning in for so long. When Nick suggested we meet in person, I hesitated at first, but the pull was too strong. We met at a hotel bar, and I'll never forget how he looked when he walked in. Confident, self-assured, like he owned the room. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 20s, with a boyish charm that put me at ease immediately. He was easy to talk to, and before I knew it, hours had passed. By the end of the night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, wanted. That first meeting turned into another, then another. Soon, Nick and I were seeing each other regularly. We kept things discreet, hotel rooms, private dinners, and late-night conversations that felt thrilling and forbidden. I told myself it didn't matter because it didn't change anything at home. I was still there for Daniel, still keeping up appearances as the perfect wife. Nick was just a distraction, a way to fill the gaps Daniel left behind. Looking back now, I can see how dangerous that mindset was. I let myself believe that I could compartmentalize, that I could have this secret life without it affecting the one I shared with Daniel. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and mine was no exception. I just didn't know yet how devastating the fallout would be. Nick was everything Daniel wasn't. Where Daniel was serious, Nick was playful. Where Daniel was methodical, Nick was spontaneous. He had this youthful energy about him that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Our connection started innocently enough. We exchanged a few flirty texts, lighthearted and fun. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a thrill every time my phone buzzed with a message from him. At first, I told myself it was just a harmless distraction, something to make the days feel less monotonous, but it didn't stay harmless for long. The first time we met in person, I was nervous. We had been texting for weeks, but seeing him in real life felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. We met at a quiet coffee shop, the kind of place where no one would recognize me. Nick arrived a few minutes late, but when he walked in, all my doubts seemed to evaporate. He was even more handsome than his pictures, tall, athletic, with an easy smile that immediately put me at ease. He sat across from me, leaning in as we talked, his attention focused solely on me. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like that, like I was the only person in the room. That meeting turned into another, and then another. We started meeting for drinks, then dinners, each time in places where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone from Daniel's world. I felt a rush every time I saw him, a mix of excitement and danger that was completely addictive. When we weren't together, we texted constantly. Nick would send me good morning messages, little compliments about how beautiful I looked in the pictures I sent, or jokes that made me laugh out loud. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I craved it. The first time things became physical, I told myself it was just a moment of weakness. We had met at a hotel bar, and after a few drinks, he suggested we go up to his room. I hesitated, but the truth was, I had already made up my mind before he even asked. When I followed him upstairs, I knew there was no turning back. I felt guilty afterward, but I rationalized it by telling myself it didn't mean anything. It wasn't like I loved Nick or wanted to leave Daniel. This was just about me, about filling a void Daniel had left behind. The affair quickly became a regular part of my life. Nick and I would meet in hotel rooms or private lounges, places where no one would question what we were doing together. He made me feel wanted, desired, and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I started spoiling him with gifts, expensive watches, tailored suits, even a new phone. It felt good to lavish him with things I knew he couldn't afford on his own. And with Daniel's wealth, it wasn't like I had to think twice about the cost. At first, I felt a pang of guilt every time I lied to Daniel. If he asked where I was going, I'd say I was meeting friends or running errands. He never questioned me. He trusted me completely, and I used that trust to my advantage. Over time, though, the guilt faded. I told myself that Daniel barely noticed my absence, that he wouldn't even care if he knew. He was so consumed by his work that I could have been gone for days, and he probably wouldn't have noticed. That thought made it easier to justify what I was doing. The more time I spent with Nick, the more confident I became in my double life. I felt like I had mastered the art of compartmentalizing, keeping my marriage and my affair in completely separate worlds. At home, I was still the dutiful wife, managing the household and keeping up appearances. With Nick, I was someone else entirely, free, uninhibited, and desired. It was like living two lives, and for a while I convinced myself that I could keep it that way forever. Looking back, I can see how reckless I was. I thought I had everything under control, that I was too careful for anything to ever go wrong. But the truth was, I was lying to myself. The cracks in my perfect facade were already forming. I just didn't know it yet. Daniel rarely made time for family. His schedule was packed with business meetings, networking events, and overseas trips. So when he told me he wanted to host a family dinner, it felt like an unusual gesture. He explained that he hadn't seen his younger brother, Nathan, in years, and thought it was time to reconnect. I didn't think much of it. I nodded along, agreeing to handle the preparations, assuming it would be another evening of polite small talk and forced smiles. The night of the dinner, everything was set. The house was spotless, the table beautifully decorated, and I had spent the day making sure every detail was perfect. Daniel was in high spirits, a rare sight. He seemed genuinely excited to catch up with his brother. I should have felt relieved that he was prioritizing something other than work, but instead I felt indifferent. My mind wasn't on the dinner at all. It was on Nick. I had seen him just a few days earlier, and my thoughts were still lingering on that encounter. When the doorbell rang, Daniel went to answer it while I stayed in the dining room, adjusting the place settings one last time. I heard voices in the entryway, Daniel's enthusiastic greeting, followed by another voice that sounded achingly familiar. My stomach dropped, and I froze in place, gripping the edge of the table. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But when I turned around and saw him walk through the doorway, my worst fear became reality. Nathan was Nick. The man I had been seeing for over a year was standing in my house, shaking Daniel's hand, grinning like this was just another family reunion. My heart pounded in my chest as he glanced over and saw me. For a brief moment, his face registered shock, but he recovered almost instantly. He greeted Daniel warmly, pretending not to notice my pale, frozen expression. I was in complete disbelief. Daniel had mentioned his younger brother before, but always in passing. I knew they were half-brothers, and that their relationship had been distant since childhood, but Daniel rarely talked about him. I had never connected the dots, never even considered that Nick could be the same person. And now he was here, standing in my dining room, acting like we were strangers. I tried to act normal, plastering a forced smile on my face as I welcomed him. My voice came out too high, too cheerful, but no one seemed to notice. Daniel was too busy catching up with Nathan, asking him about his travels and his work. Meanwhile, I felt like I was suffocating, my mind racing as I tried to figure out how to get through the evening without everything falling apart. Nathan, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He kept sneaking glances at me, his lips curling into a knowing smirk whenever our eyes met. He was enjoying this, savoring the power he now had over me. I, on the other hand, felt like I was walking a tightrope, one wrong move away from disaster. I avoided his gaze as much as I could, focusing on serving the food and keeping the conversation flowing, but the tension was unbearable. Dinner was excruciating. Daniel, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, was in a rare good mood, laughing and joking with his brother. Nathan played along perfectly, charming and charismatic, slipping into the role of the prodigal sibling without missing a beat. But every so often, his gaze would flicker to me, his smirk widening just enough to make my stomach twist. He was toying with me, and there was nothing I could do about it. At one point, Nathan asked me to pass the salt, his voice casual but dripping with amusement. My hands shook as I handed it to him, and I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. I could barely eat, barely speak, terrified that Daniel would notice the tension. I kept telling myself to breathe, to hold it together, until the evening was over, but the minutes felt like hours. Toward the end of the meal, when I thought I might finally make it through unscathed, Nathan decided to strike. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine, and made a comment about how it was nice to see me again. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Daniel glanced between us, his brow furrowing in confusion. I felt my heart stop. I forced a laugh, waving it off as a misunderstanding. "Oh, I think you must be confusing me with someone else," I said, my voice light but strained. Nathan didn't miss a beat. He smiled, shrugging as if to say it wasn't a big deal, but the damage was done. Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face before he let it go. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely registered the conversation, too consumed by panic to focus. When Nathan finally left, giving me one last smirk as he walked out the door, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. I could feel the weight of Daniel's gaze as he watched me clean up, his silence louder than any question he could have asked. I knew then that the situation was far from over. Update. Hi, Reddit. So things have become worse than I thought. A few days after the dinner, I thought I might have dodged a bullet. I had managed to make it through the evening without Nathan spilling the truth, and Daniel hadn't asked me any follow-up questions about the awkward moment Nathan had created. I was still on edge, but I convinced myself that Nathan had too much to lose by coming clean. After all, if Daniel found out, it would reflect just as badly on him as it would on me, maybe even worse. I underestimated Nathan. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything unraveled. Daniel had been working from home that day, locked in his office on a series of calls. I was downstairs scrolling through my phone and trying to shake the lingering anxiety that had been hanging over me since the dinner. Then I heard his office door open. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as he walked down the hall toward the living room. When he appeared, his expression stopped me cold. He was holding his phone in one hand, his knuckles white around it. His face was calm, too calm, and his eyes were fixed on me in a way that made my stomach turn. I opened my mouth to ask him what was wrong, but before I could speak, he tossed the phone onto the couch beside me. The screen was lit up, displaying a text thread. It only took me a second to recognize it. They were messages between Nathan and me, screenshots of every conversation we'd had on the sugar dating site. My chest tightened as I scrolled through them, each line of text a reminder of the secrets I thought I had buried. There were messages where I'd joked about Daniel's busy schedule, about how easy it was to slip away unnoticed. There were conversations where I had planned our meetings, made promises, even suggested gifts I could buy for Nathan. It was all there, in black and white. I looked up at Daniel, my heart pounding. He didn't yell. He didn't even flinch. His voice was low, steady, and colder than I had ever heard it. He told me that Nathan had called him earlier that day. Apparently, Nathan couldn't resist the temptation to stir the pot. He had told Daniel everything, about the sugar dating site, the affair, the gifts. He hadn't left out a single detail. I tried to explain, to tell Daniel that I didn't know who Nathan was, that it was all a horrible coincidence. But before I could finish a single sentence, he raised his hand to stop me. He said it didn't matter whether I knew or not. The fact was, I had cheated on him for over a year. I had lied, betrayed him, and dragged his family into the mess I had created. He didn't raise his voice once, but his calmness was more terrifying than any shouting match could have been. He told me he wanted a divorce, and not just a divorce. He said he would make sure I walked away with nothing. Every word was measured, deliberate, and final. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. When he left the room, I sat there in silence, staring at his phone. The receipts were there too, proof of the expensive gifts I had bought Nathan using Daniel's credit card. Watches, clothes, dinners at high-end restaurants. It was all laid out in brutal detail. I hadn't even realized how much Nathan had taken until I saw it all in one place. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The morning after Daniel confronted me, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls and messages from his parents. My first thought was that Daniel had already told them everything, but part of me hoped I was wrong. I hesitated for hours, too afraid to return their calls, but eventually, I couldn't avoid it anymore. When I finally called Daniel's mother back, I knew within seconds that my worst fears had come true. Her voice was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she used to greet me with. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She asked me outright how I could betray Daniel, how I could bring such shame to their family. I stammered, trying to explain, but every word felt hollow even as I said it. I told her I hadn't known who Nathan was, that it was all a terrible mistake. But she cut me off, her tone dripping with disdain as she said it didn't matter whether I knew or not. The damage had been done, and in her eyes, I was the one to blame. She accused me of driving a wedge between Daniel and Nathan, of tearing apart a family that had already been fragile. She said I had ruined her son, that Daniel had worked so hard to build a life for us, only for me to destroy it all. Her words were sharp, calculated, and they cut deeper than I thought possible. I tried to defend myself, but my voice faltered under the weight of her anger. By the time the call ended, I was in tears, clutching the phone like it could somehow shield me from the reality of what was happening. Nathan, of course, wasted no time inserting himself into the narrative. He seemed to revel in the chaos, like a spectator enjoying a particularly juicy drama. From what I later learned, he had been the one to call Daniel's parents, spinning the story in a way that made him look like the victim. He painted me as a manipulative, scheming woman who had taken advantage of him, who had lured him into the affair with false promises and lavish gifts. What he conveniently left out, of course, was how willingly he had participated. He didn't mention how he had been the one to encourage our meetings, how he had accepted every single gift without hesitation. He didn't tell them about the times he had teased me for being too generous, or joked about how easy it was to use Daniel's wealth. Instead, he framed himself as an innocent bystander who had been swept up in my supposed deceit. The worst part was, people believed him. Nathan had this charm about him, a way of talking that made you want to trust him. Even when he was lying through his teeth, he did it with such confidence that you almost couldn't doubt him. And I had no defense, no way to prove that the story he was telling wasn't the whole truth. The family was in chaos. Daniel barely spoke to anyone in those first few days, keeping his conversations short and focused solely on the logistics of the divorce. He shut down completely, retreating into himself in a way that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. I could see how much pain he was in, but he wouldn't let anyone help him. He wouldn't let me help him. Not that I deserved to, but still. Daniel's parents were caught in the middle, torn between supporting their eldest son and confronting the younger one. On one hand, they were furious with Nathan for his role in the affair. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell they saw his actions as a betrayal, not just of Daniel, but of the entire family. On the other hand, he was still their son, their baby, and no matter how much damage he had caused, they couldn't bring themselves to cut him off entirely. At one point, Daniel's father tried to broker a conversation between his two sons. He called me afterward, his voice strained and tired, to tell me it had gone terribly. Daniel had barely spoken, responding to Nathan's attempts at reconciliation with cold, one-word answers. Nathan, in typical fashion, played the part of the wounded party, insisting that he had no idea who I was when we first met, that he had been blindsided just as much as Daniel had. It was all lies, of course, but that didn't stop him from saying it. The conversation ended with Daniel walking out of the room, leaving their father standing there, helpless and defeated. When he recounted it to me, I could hear the disappointment in his voice, not just in Nathan, but in me. He didn't say it outright, but I knew he held me responsible for all of it. If Daniel's father was disappointed, his mother was furious. She called me again a few days after our initial conversation, and this time she didn't hold back. She told me that she had tried to give me the benefit of the doubt, but now she couldn't believe she had ever welcomed me into their family. She accused me of ruining not just my marriage, but the bond between her sons. She said she had always suspected I wasn't good enough for Daniel, and now I had proven her right. Her words were sharp and cutting, but what hurt the most was the truth in them. I had ruined my marriage. I had driven a wedge between Daniel and Nathan, and no matter how much I wanted to blame Nathan for his part in it, I couldn't escape the fact that I was the one who had started it all. I was the one who had joined that site, who had pursued the affair, who had lied to Daniel for over a year. By the time she hung up, I felt like I had been stripped of everything, my dignity, my reputation, even my sense of self. I realized then that I had no allies left. The people who had once been my family, who had welcomed me with open arms, now saw me as a pariah. And the worst part was, I couldn't even blame them. Daniel asked me to leave the house 2 days after he confronted me. He said it wasn't a request, it was a demand. He didn't want to see me, didn't want me anywhere near him while we worked through the divorce. I packed a few bags and left, taking only my personal belongings. As I walked out the door, I realized how little of the life we had built together was actually mine. The house, the cars, the clothes, all of it was tied to Daniel's wealth, his success. Without him, I had nothing. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the neighborhoods and social circles I was used to. It was quiet, cramped, and painfully ordinary. At first I thought I could lean on my friends for support, but one by one, they turned their backs on me. News of the affair had spread quickly, and most of them sided with Daniel. They saw me as the villain, the ungrateful wife who had thrown away a good man for a fling. Even the friends who didn't openly condemn me kept their distance. They stopped answering my calls, stopped inviting me to gatherings. I felt like a pariah, exiled from the life I once knew. Every time I left the apartment, I worried about running into someone who had heard the story. The thought of facing their judgment, their pity, was unbearable. Nathan, the one person who might have understood, was nowhere to be found. After stirring up the drama, he had cut ties with me completely. I heard through the grapevine that he was already seeing someone new, flaunting their relationship on social media. It stung, but it wasn't surprising. He had gotten what he wanted and moved on without a second thought. Sitting alone in that apartment, I had a lot of time to think. For the first time, I started to see the full extent of what I had done. I had let my loneliness, my insecurities, and my desire for attention lead me down a path that destroyed everything. I had taken Daniel's trust for granted, assuming it would always be there no matter what I did. I had lied to myself, convincing myself that the affair was harmless, that it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered more than I ever realized. I thought about the nights Daniel had worked late, the trips he had taken, the times I had felt invisible in my own marriage. I thought those moments justified my actions, but they didn't. I could have talked to him, told him how I felt, fought for our marriage instead of running away from it. But I didn't, and now I was left with nothing but regret. Update. Hi Reddit, this is going to be my last post here. I have actually realized a lot OG things. The first sign of how serious Daniel was about the divorce came just 2 days after I moved out. A courier arrived at my apartment with an envelope. Inside were the divorce papers. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the documents, my hands trembling. I had known this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it real. Daniel wasn't just walking away, he was making sure I walked away with nothing. The papers outlined every detail. Daniel's legal team was working to protect his assets, and they were ruthless. The house, the cars, the joint accounts, everything was off limits. Even the jewelry he had gifted me over the years was itemized, with some pieces listed as assets tied to his estate. The only thing I was entitled to was my personal savings, which, compared to the life I'd been living, was laughable. For years, I hadn't thought twice about money. Daniel's wealth had always felt like an endless pool, something that would always be there. I had swiped credit cards without looking at the balances, booked vacations without considering the cost, and bought designer clothes as if they were essentials. But now, for the first time, I realized how little of it was actually mine. The lifestyle I had taken for granted was gone, and there was no getting it back. I tried to fight it, hiring a lawyer with what little money I had left. But Daniel's legal team was relentless. They had evidence of my affair, receipts for the gifts I had bought Nathan, and even screenshots of messages where I joked about using Daniel's money. My lawyer advised me to settle, warning me that if I pushed back, I might end up owing Daniel more than I could afford to pay. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I signed the papers. When the divorce was finalized, I walked away with almost nothing. The life I had built, or thought I had built, was gone in an instant, and I had no one to blame but myself. After the divorce was finalized, I tried to reach out to Nathan. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe some acknowledgement of the role he had played in all of this, or at the very least, an apology. But my calls went unanswered, and my texts were ignored. It didn't take long for me to figure out why. One day, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post that stopped me cold. It was a picture of Nathan with a woman I didn't recognize, her arms wrapped around him as they smiled for the camera. The caption read, "New adventures with my favorite person." My stomach dropped. As I clicked through his profile, the truth became painfully clear. Nathan had moved on, and he wasn't shy about flaunting it. There were pictures of them at restaurants, on vacation, even at events I used to attend with him. The same charm and attention he had once lavished on me were now being directed at someone else. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I knew Nathan wasn't someone I could rely on, but seeing how quickly he had replaced me felt like a punch to the gut. For over a year, I had convinced myself that what we had was special, that he had cared about me in some way. But now it was clear that I had been nothing more than a convenient source of money and excitement for him. Once the gifts and the secrecy were gone, so was he. The scandal didn't stay private for long. Word of the affair spread quickly through our social circles, and soon I became the subject of whispers and judgment everywhere I went. Friends I had once considered close started distancing themselves, and I couldn't blame them. To them, I wasn't just the woman who had cheated on her husband. I was the woman who had cheated with his brother. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of their stares. At the grocery store, the gym, even just walking down the street, I could feel the whispers following me. It was like being trapped in a fishbowl, every mistake I had made on display for the world to see. I stopped going to social events entirely. The thought of facing those people, of hearing their fake sympathy or outright disdain, was too much to bear. Even the few friends who hadn't completely cut me off treated me differently. Their conversations were stilted, filled with awkward pauses and subtle jabs that reminded me of how far I had fallen in their eyes. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to thrive in the aftermath. He played the part of the betrayed husband perfectly, using the scandal to his advantage. He became the sympathetic figure, the man who had been wronged by his ungrateful wife and duplicitous brother. His public image only grew stronger, and people rallied around him. He was invited to more events, featured in more articles, and praised for handling the situation with grace. I couldn't even be angry about it. He deserved their sympathy. He had been a good husband in his own way, and I had thrown it all away for something fleeting and meaningless. Sitting alone in my small, cramped apartment, I had more time than I wanted to think about how I had ended up here. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched and cheap. It was a far cry from the luxurious home I had shared with Daniel, the life I had taken for granted. For the first time, I started to see the full extent of what I had done. I had let my insecurities and loneliness drive me to make choices that destroyed everything. I told myself for so long that it wasn't my fault, that Daniel's neglect had pushed me to seek attention elsewhere. But the truth was, I had other options. I could have talked to him, fought for our marriage, worked on the issues that had been driving us apart. Instead, I had chosen the easy way out, indulging in a fantasy that had no place in reality. I thought about Daniel, about all the times he had tried to include me in his world, to show me that he cared in his own way. I had dismissed those efforts as not enough, but now I saw how much he had given me. I thought about Nathan, about how easily I had let him manipulate me, how I had convinced myself that what we had was real. And I thought about myself, the woman I had become, so consumed by her own desires that she had destroyed the one thing she could never replace. The loneliness that had once driven me to the affair was nothing compared to the loneliness I felt now. I had lost everything, my husband, my reputation, my friends, even my sense of self. And the worst part was knowing that I had no one to blame but myself. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the lies you tell yourself are the most dangerous. I convinced myself that my actions didn't matter, that I could keep my affair separate from my marriage, that I wasn't hurting anyone, but I was wrong. Every choice I made had consequences, not just for me, but for everyone around me. Reddit, I know I'm the villain in this story. I made the choices that led to this, and now I'm paying the price. But if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Don't let your own insecurities and selfishness destroy the people who love you. Don't make the same mistakes I did, because once you've lost everything, there's no going back. I can't help wondering, if I had realized sooner, if I had stopped before it was too late, could I have saved us? Or is this the punishment I deserve for what I've done?